It is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marie-Hélène Budworth. I've actually met Marie about 24 years ago when she agreed to take her life into her own hands and be my chemistry lab partner. And thankfully, we both survived, and she has gone on to be a leader in her field of organizational behavior and human resources management. Her particular focus is on understanding how people learn, acquire knowledge, make choices, and negotiate with one another on how to succeed. In her time as associate professor at the School of Human Resources Management at York University, Marie has created the negotiation program for her faculty, and she has also trained thousands of emergent workers and executives. She also provides in-house training for organizations in a range of industries, including legal and other professional services. Furthermore, her work has been published in a range of peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Vocational Behavior, Human Resources Management, and the Canadian Journal of Behavioral Sciences. So thank you for joining us, Marie, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I love that introduction. As you can tell by the fact that Mari and I both have all of our fingers, full set of eyebrows, and based on our long careers in chemistry, our experience together was a raging success. So I have just a few ground rules before we get started as well, just to give you some insight into how I hope this will work. Despite the fact that I'm up here and that it's all very formal because of the cameras, I do hope that I'll get some questions from you, or at least some insights, some thoughts on how this applies to what you're doing. So everything I bring to you is research-based. It's based on my work as an academic, some of the research I do myself, and research that my colleagues do. And I'm very much aware that there are variations based on the context that you're in. Right? You're in a legal services firm. Some of you are in corporations acting as general counsel. And there are ways in which this will apply that vary depending on your context. So I'm interested in hearing that. I'm interested in hearing your own insights. And some of this might actually sound familiar, right? So I might actually, I'm sure in a lot of cases, just name for you things that you already know, which I find is often a useful activity as well, to be able to organize information that you already have in your head in one way, but to give you a way of talking about it or naming it. So today, the topic that I'm covering is broadly known as influence. Right? How do we influence others? And I'm going to draw from three streams of research. The first is social network analysis. The second is social psychology. And the third is organizational behavior. So we'll go through some studies, but I'll try and be light on the intense research and really talk about how it applies and what it looks like and why it has meaning. Okay, is that a fair start today? Great, I'm going to get nods, and then I'm slowly going to get people talking, hopefully, as we go through our time together here. So I'm going to start by talking about social networks. So social network analysis, social network theory, this is a very broadly studied area. It's a space that is studied by both psychologists and computer scientists and mathematicians. I'm doing a lot of feedbacking. Is that okay? Bring it away? Okay. Thank you. So this technique is used a great deal to study a wide range of things. In any space where people are connected to each other, social network analysis is a useful way of looking at those connections. So you've all seen this in one way or another, right? So you've seen pictures where you have dots and then lines connecting those dots, and the dots are meant to be people, the lines are meant to be how they're connected to one another. And the lines can mean anything, right? So most in terms of the way that it's mostly been used, it's in the medical sciences. Those lines are the flow of disease a lot of the time, right? So we use it in the behavioral sciences to talk about the flow of information, the flow of resources, the flow of information, so the flow of learning, how people learn from one another. And it can also be used to talk about how we influence one another within organizational settings. Right, so I'm going to talk for a little bit about how we have come to understand how people shift and change based on their connections to one another. And also we know a great deal about where you are in your network determines the type of influence you have over the overall network. Okay, this will become clear in a second. But first I want to start by saying what networks are not. I'm not talking about your LinkedIn status, any type of social media. I'm talking about true social connections. So I know you, you know the person beside you, and you know the person beside that, right? So these are connections based on our interactions, right? So as with any good research, we're going to start with Kevin Bacon. So the reason we're starting with Kevin Bacon, there's actually a really good reason for this. Has anybody played or is anybody aware of the Kevin Bacon game? Yeah, okay. And as is not, some of you are. Yeah, this is a great game. It's a great dinner table game. You sit down and you ask you pick an actor, any actor, who's a living or dead, but has been a contemporary of Kevin Bacon, so alive at the same time as Kevin Bacon, and ask, how many steps can you take to get back to Kevin Bacon? What is that actor's Kevin Bacon number? You actually can Google an actor's name and Kevin Bacon number, and that game is so pervasive that comes up for you. Right? So just to give you an example, I need a paper for this because I'm horrible at this game. So Zach Galifianakis, his Kevin Bacon number is 2, because Zach Galifianakis and Michael Keaton were in Birdman. Michael Keaton and Kevin Bacon appeared in She's Having a Baby, right? So that's 2. Amy Schumer's Kevin Bacon number is 2 as well. Amy Schumer and Steve Carell appeared in Seeking a Friend for the End of the World, and Steve Carell and Kevin Bacon were in Crazy Stupid Love, right? So that's how you play the game. The reason this is significant is because this game works with Kevin Bacon. It doesn't work with very many other actors. So you can't play the Tom Cruise game. You can't play the Deborah Messing game. You got to play the Kevin Bacon game. There's a really good reason for that. The reason is that Kevin Bacon is attached to 85% of the actors in the International Movie Database. Everybody does people know the IMDb, the International Movie Database? He's connected to everybody in the IMDb in 85% of the actors in 6 steps or less. Right? So think about Kevin Bacon. Why does this work with Kevin Bacon and not with these other actors? It's because of his network. It has to do with how he's developed his network, what his network looks like, his professional network. Kevin Bacon has played everything, and he's been in every genre. Right? He's been in drama, in comedy, in musicals. He's been a good guy, a bad guy, the lead, the secondary supporting character. He's been in half-hour sitcoms. He's been guest star, right? Tom Cruise has played the same character 47 times. Right? So it doesn't work for him because he keeps working with the same set of actors, whereas Kevin Bacon's network is rich and deep. So in terms of social networks, we would say Kevin Bacon he's a connector. He has a great deal of connections because of the structure of his network, because he's gone deliberately and had a varied career. Right? You spend most of your time doing one thing only. You keep working with the same 5 or 6 people. You limit your social network, whereas Kevin Bacon has gone out of his way, probably based on interest more than anything else, to create this wider social network. So what does this mean? So let's talk for a second about how you actually garner influence within a social network. So we have, within our social networks, we have both strong ties and weak ties. We have people that we are deeply connected to, and we have people that we are connected to on the periphery. Think about how you use your close, deep connections. Right? These are the people that you probably lean on for advice. They're the people who you trust, who you might ask for a bit of guidance, a bit of insight. They might be the people that you bounce ideas off of in terms of your next steps, your decisions, your future career. Think about how you use the people on the periphery of your network, or the weaker connections. Right? The weaker connections are where you get new information. It's where novel ideas are held, novel opportunities, and novel resources. So let's say for a moment that Mari and I are a deep, strong connection. Everything I know, she knows. So she's very useful for me in terms of psychosocial support and other very useful activities. But in terms of helping me find a new job or helping me find a new opportunity, not so much. Right? We often talk in social network analysis about the power of weak ties. The people beyond the people up and around your network are the people where you can often gain new information. Okay, so that's just one little thing, but so what we really want to focus on today is to talk about, well, how do you understand how people influence their network, right? Like how do you make a difference about what's happening with the people around you, and how do you motivate, change behavior, change ideas, influence those who are deeply connected and connected in peripheral ways within your network? Well, social network analysts talk about a few characteristics of network that give people within the network positional power. So it gives you, as the person who holds this space in your network, an opportunity to really have influence. And here are some of the characteristics. The first is centrality. This is the label that they use, but essentially all it means is that you have a lot of connections to a lot of people. So if you look at this network that's on the chart, on the slide here, is actually my LinkedIn network. So there's this fun little app that you can, if you go into LinkedIn, you can use your LinkedIn profile to create a visual network. It's not a terribly useful network. I'm sure I haven't spoken to half the people in that network in a very long time, but it gives us something to look at visually, right? So well, it is my network, so I am central to this network. But if you're central to the network, your dot is connected to all kinds of other dots, right? You see lots of webbing around you as a person. So if you have a lot of connections, not necessarily strong connections, but good, solid connections to a lot of people, a lot of information and resources flow through you. It gives you centrality, which gives you influence in how things flow through that network. That type of positional strength is really good for managing laterally. There's a focus on horizontal relationships. When we see people with highly centralized networks, we know that they're the tastemakers among their peers, right? They have huge influence on trends and ideas and what people are going for within that network, horizontally. Does that make sense? Any questions, queries about that? Another characteristic that gives you power within a network is flexibility. So you don't just have one network, you have lots of networks, right? The extent to which you can move around in a network, that you can perform different roles, that you can do lots of different things, and you can think about this as your professional function as well. The extent to which you can do this type of work and that type of work and this type of work gives you leverage, right? Gives you some sort of credit that you can then take that also gives you some positional power. And if we're talking about it in terms of power, and I'm going to clarify that word in a few minutes as well. Then there's one more characteristic that I want to point out about networks before I go a little bit more deeply into how you trade value within a social network. The last one is visibility. How visible you are within your network also gives you influence. So we see different patterns within networks, and I'm sure if you drew your company's network, you would see that there are folks who are right in the middle of things, the connectors. You might also see bridgers. I only have one hand, but if I had a second hand, you might see people two different networks. You can think of your organization. Some organizations have multiple networks because you have subcultures or different departments or different things operate in different spaces. And then there are the people that bridge those two networks. Right? Those we would call bridgers. And then you also have people who live on the periphery. So, I can't believe I'm going to give the example of an IT person. As I'm here hooked up to all this IT, I don't know what can happen to me as I give this example. But that person is a supporter of the overall function, but isn't necessarily in the business of the corporation. So they might find themselves on the bit of a periphery of the network. They're important to the network, but they're not as deeply connected with the network. Right? So all of these positions are important for telling us how much influence any individual has within the network. And you can actually map out the way that where you operate within your network, where everybody else is within your network. You can map your corporation. As there are times where I've gone in and mapped out an organization for people, just to help people understand where the blocks are in terms of new information or acquiring new management tools, why they're not moving all the way through the network, right? Who's blocking, where are things stopping? A social network can help us understand all of those things. So social networks are incredibly powerful tools for helping you understand where you have influence, your scope of influence, and how that influence operates, right? And think about the type of network you're trying to create for yourself. Am I central to my network? Am I important to my network? Am I core to the function of the network that I want to be a part of? Right? All of this will give you deeper and richer influence. So I've given it to you in a very high-level way, but I'll pause there for a sec to see if there are any questions about that. Nothing from the room? Yeah?
So I know you said there was an app that said that you could create your LinkedIn network. Is there any way that if you were just, after this morning, you're back in your office and you're like, I'd like to understand where I am in my network. Is there a easy way to kind of map, or if you were looking at doing it for your organization, what kind of other tools out there that can assist people to do that? There
are tools. So it's not an easy thing to sit down and do with a piece of pencil and paper. There's log mathematics and things like that. It's a fairly complicated thing to map out. So essentially what it would mean is what the computer program would do is go to each person within the organization and ask a target question. So it depends on what resource you're trying to map out, right? So if I'm trying to map out, I'm often interested in learning, how learning flows through an organization. I would go to you and say, if you were looking for information, who are 3 people you would go to within the organization, and you would list those 3 people, and then I would have you give me some quantitative metrics on the extent to which their information is useful. Right? I would ask you a series of questions, and then I would go to the next person, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person, and that would all go into a database and create a visual on what that looks like. And the visual is it's a spider web where if you pick up one node, the whole thing comes up, you drop it, it all falls in the same way because people are connected in the same way. The length of the line often means the strength of the connection. You can map all kinds of other variables on top of it. You can map things like gender or position within the organization, so associate versus partner versus staff or so on, and you can get all kinds of rich information. Any other questions? Okay. So that's some very high-level information that is, I feel like in terms of practical usage, is a little bit ambiguous because without mapping out your network, it's hard to know where you stand. But you can take away some little tidbits around trying to make yourself central to the network, trying to make sure that you're adding value to your network, trying to make sure that that you're making yourself visible within your network. Right? So visibility in terms of self-promotion, making sure that you're presenting your own ideas and not allowing others to present your ideas. Those types of things help you to focus on vertical relationships within a network. So that's all useful. But I want to get down to some very practical, how do you inject value into your network and draw value out of your network? So I'm actually going to, we'll have the idea of networks in the background as we move forward, but really we're going to move into the space of social psychology right now. And this is where it all gets a little fun. So let's talk first about reciprocity. Everybody knows this term a little bit? Yeah? So reciprocity is this beautiful, wonderful, foundational idea upon which our entire world is built. Right? If I give you something, it creates in you the desire to give me something in return. Right? That is, it's the system on which our whole world operates, and it is such a deeply ingrained human behavior that you can test it out at any moment in time and see some very predictable results. Right? So you can sit down at dinner tonight, if you're eating with somebody at a restaurant, and offer them some of the food on your plate. Almost certainly, what will you hear back? Would you like some of mine? Right? Like, that's reciprocity. Would you like to taste my pasta? Sure. Would you like to taste my chicken? Right? This is how we operate. I give you something, and almost immediately you have a feeling that you want to return that favor. So this is a really powerful tool for influence as well. And there are lots of reasons for this. So we're going to talk about reciprocity for a little while here. But in terms of your social network, we know that people who are giving into their social network, so doing favors, helping out here or there, are the ones who are actually gaining the most from their social networks. So let's unpack that for a quick minute. Too far. We talk about 3 types of reciprocity. So this is from work by a colleague of mine who's at the Wharton School in Pennsylvania, and his name is Adam Grant. He wrote a book a couple years ago that really summarizes this stuff nicely. If you're interested in it, I can make sure that you get the reference. But he talks about 3 types of reciprocity that he's given. The reason I mention him clearly is because he's the one who's given these labels: takers, matchers, givers. We call them something else in academic terms, but I think these are really good labels for taking away the message. So he talks about reciprocity or this exchange as people having 3 preferences, right? I'll start by talking about takers because I'm sure that's an easy one to get. You all have met them. You all are a bit suspicious of them, right? These are folks who often take resources from you or are very happy to take anything that you offer, but very, very, very reluctant to give, right? So they're often seen as difficult personalities, and these are not personality types. These are preferences for behavior, right? So that would be one category. The givers, on the other hand, are exactly what you would expect. They give without discretion, right? They give freely, openly, without expecting anything in return. That's kind of the characteristic, the underlying characteristic. And the matchers is the large majority of us. The matchers are a bit cautious. They're the ones who I will give when I know I will receive, and we will do this exchange of favors, right? So I'll introduce you to somebody, knowing that down the road you might help me out, right? I'll connect you to that resource, knowing that down the road I might expect, you do me a favor, that whole thing, right? Like the old Godfather thing. Most of us are matchers because that's the cautious behavior, that's the safe behavior. There are a few takers, they're very easy to spot. But then there are the givers. There are the folks who are freely injecting value into their network. So here's the question I have for you. Who do you think, so I'll back up a little bit and say, this has been studied widely, this idea of giving and reciprocity. And I'm going to cite what's called a meta-analysis, which is when you take all the data that you have and you put it into one pot and figure out what the big trends are, right? So these findings are based on over 30,000 people across industries, medical, engineering, and business professionals. If I ask you, who is most successful of these 3 categories? Who are the most successful? So for medical, it was actually medical students that's most successful meant highest grades. For engineers, it meant project completion and timelines. And for business people, it meant performance ratings, right? So the metric's a bit different, but outcome success is the thing that we're looking at. Who do you think is the most successful? Do you think it's takers? Do you think it's matchers? Some of you think it's matchers. Do you think it's givers? You think it's givers. Here's the bad news. Givers are actually the least successful. What? Oh my gosh, that's so discouraging, right? Givers are the least successful. So why would givers be the least successful? If you give without discretion, you give away all your time to do your own work, to really be successful in your own sphere. But you are also right, because givers are also the most successful. Givers are on both sides of the curve. Givers are the most successful when they have found a way to give that is controlled, that is still giving without the expectation of receiving, but it doesn't take them to the point of burnout. Right? So one nuance, just to illustrate that nuance, I'll say that with there was a group of med students, so like those who were practicing medicine, and they were part of the study. And the group where it said, I would do anything for my patients, they're the ones who are on the bottom end of the spectrum. The ones on the top end are, my patient outcomes are important to me. Right? Like, I really want to do well at this job, and I'm going to put everything I have into it, but not at the cost of myself. Right? So you understand your own limits. You found a way to give that still allows you to get your own work done. As another example, you might find that you can give into your network in a way that is easy for you, or that is good for you, that you find you have a strength for, right? So something that I like to do a great deal, given the amount of people that I meet in a year, the amount of students I'm exposed to, or the number of students rather that I'm exposed to, the number of professionals I'm exposed to, I find it really easy, useful, and rewarding to connect people. So if I have a student who comes to me and says, oh, Marie, I'm really interested in getting into logistics, it just takes a quick second for me to think back, well, when's the last person I met a professional in logistics? Oh, how about I see if they're willing to talk to you, right? Huge reward, like in terms of, the student gets something huge out of it. The person who's a practitioner often gets a great deal out of it as well, because they feel they're able to do something for somebody, they feel good about having the conversation, and I get something out of it quickly, right? It doesn't really take up much of my day, but it's something that's valued by everybody. Right? So that type of giving, the type of giving where you give freely and easily without expecting anything in return, but you follow your strengths, you follow what you're able to do for people, and what you can fit into the work that you already have on your plate. Those types of givers are enormously successful in our world. And here's part of the reason why. Part of the reason why goes back to the social networks that we talked a lot about before. You're enriching, not only are you building your social network, so you're becoming more central to your network, you're also injecting value along those lines, along those connections. And the value that comes back to you might not come directly from the line that you put it through. So I might do something for an ath, but that might not be where I draw the value. I might get the value from somewhere over here, because reputationally in my network, I am now central, I am now a giver, I am now somebody who adds a great deal of value. I have created influence within my network structure by following this pattern of behavior. So the advice that I often give around these findings is be the first to give. Right? Don't fall prey to the idea that matching is a safe way of doing things. Try giving, and giving in ways that you can do safely and easily, and that don't interfere with the rest of your day. Don't burn out on giving, but give freely, and that value will come back to you in different ways. So that's the core message for reciprocity. Any thoughts, questions about that? You okay? I can see you're with me because you're nodding. Yeah? But we're okay. Okay, great. The next idea that I want to talk about, and they're all connected, so we're not really jumping around too much, but I want to talk about how so we're going to move into the space of how you structure. Now you're on the receiving end. How you structure your asks, your requests, in order to have influence in terms of gaining reward, in terms of getting what you're asking for, right? This is largely or often about managing up. How do you structure things so that you can convince people, or you can influence people into coming on side? So I have a few things to say about this that ultimately gets us back to reciprocity. So we'll connect it in just a few seconds. So there are a few things from social psychology that we know quite clearly in terms of how you should deliver or structure your message in order to have to be the most compelling request. One is that your message, if possible, should contain a social proof, right? Should contain some sort of, this is the old argument of everybody else is doing it. If you can show that everybody else is doing it, you'll actually be able to go a little bit further. So this is why they in the subway system, when you see somebody playing a musical instrument, a busker, they never have an empty guitar case. There's always a little bit of money in it. It's a social proof. I'm worth paying, right? Like this, somebody has already given me money, so clearly you should give me money too. So if you have social proof within your argument, that can be a strength. One of the ones that I think is most useful is this idea of commitment and consistency. So that simply means that if I can get somebody to agree to an idea early when it's vague and really at the level of intent, I can often get them to agree to the practical reality of it. So as an example, I'll give you some of the classic studies. Here I will talk about a little bit of a study because it's just such a fun study. Some of the classic studies that were done at Stanford that illustrate this point. So a series of research assistants went out onto the streets of New York and talked to people on the streets, asking them the question, if you were given an opportunity to volunteer with underprivileged kids who were at risk of incarceration, so they were kids who had already broken the law, but for some reason had been given reprieve, but needed to have a mentor or somebody that they worked with in order to support part of the rehabilitation. So if in the future you were asked to do something like that, would you be willing to help out in that way? There's no commitment. We're just trying to get a sense of how many people would be willing to do something like that. And almost like lots of people say yes to that as an idea, right? Lofty idea. Oh, yes, that sounds like valuable work. I would really like to contribute in that way. I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. Okay, super, thank you. That's the end of our survey. Please fill out this form just so that we have a record of our conversation, but there's no further commitment, and thank you for your time. And they walk away. And then all of a sudden, about a month and a half later, they get a telephone call from what they think is a volunteer association, but really it's the lab calling, and asks them, we have this trip to Coney Island that we're running with a group of youth. Here are their circumstances. Would you like to volunteer a couple of hours of your time on Sunday to accompany this group to Coney Island? Of the people who had been approached on the street and asked the question about their intent, there were about 80% of those people who were willing to volunteer. Another group had been approached on the street and asked some random question. Of those people, almost no one volunteered. So if you can get people to signal their alignment with the big idea, you can get them to agree. Now, many of you are already doing this. If you are having conversations with people before the meeting to talk to them about, what do you think about this? Right? If you're having conversations with people when they're hatching the idea before the practical framework has been laid down, you're taking advantage of commitment and consistency rather. You can also see examples of it at this time of year with marketing campaigns, and I don't know how much it happens anymore, but it certainly happened when my kids were younger, where there was like the it toy, and then the it toy would sell out. For my older son, it's Tickle Me Elmo. Do you remember the Tickle Me Elmo? Well, you could not find a Tickle Me Elmo in December, right? It's a $200 toy, it's gone. So I go to Toys R Us and buy $200 worth of other toys for my son, show up on Christmas morning with these wonderful other toys. He's fine with them, but in January when they restock the shelves, I still buy a Tickle Me Elmo for $200 because that was my intent initially, right? So I don't know if Toys R Us is savvy enough to really be doing that purposefully, but it's the same. We're working on the same principle of human behavior. That if I make a commitment early on, when it comes time or I'm given an opportunity to follow through, I will do so. Here's the last little bit about delivering your message that I want to talk about this morning, and it's also connected. So we're back to the idea of reciprocity. Is everybody okay? Any questions? We're back to the idea of reciprocity. Reciprocity also works in the negative. So that's actually hard to understand, but I'll give you a very clear example. If I approach somebody with a request, and I have two possibilities, option A, option B. Option A is a much bigger ask. Option B is a much softer ask. If I go in with option B, I've already cut myself off a little bit, right? If I go in with option A, the person says no, I counter with option B. They go from no to yes. Concessions. Reciprocity works in the form of concessions. If I make a concession, the other person will make a concession. I'll give you another example. You get a call sometime around now from a charitable organization. And they say, would you like to be a monthly giver? Here's some of our programs for monthly giving. You're like, well, I don't think I can commit to monthly giving. Right? So they made an offer, option A. You said no. They're about to make a concession. So they say, okay, if you can't be a monthly giver, would you be able to give us a one-time donation? There's a possibility that you'll go from your no to yes. One last example, because I taught this in a class once to a bunch of, I suppose they were 19 at the time. I was teaching a negotiations class and I was talking about concessions and reciprocity. And Bina puts up her hand. She's like, Marie, I have the best example of this. It's like, I wanted a new computer, a new laptop. And she has a laptop, so, anybody whose parents in the room, she has a laptop. She doesn't need a new laptop. But she goes to her father and says, Dad, I would really like a laptop. She really wants this Toshiba version. She's picked it out. She loves everything about it. It's hers. Like she wants it. But she goes to her dad and she says, Dad, I would love this Apple MacBook. Could I get this Apple MacBook? Here's how it would help me. Here's what I want. Here's why I need it for school. And her dad's like, Apple MacBooks are $2,000. Like, there's no way I can't get you an Apple MacBook. That's just not going to happen. So Bina, being the savvy negotiator, says, okay, well, maybe not the Apple MacBook, but how about this Toshiba? And Dad goes from no to, $1,200 Toshiba. That seems reasonable. Sure, we can get the Toshiba. It's the same thing. Concessions work in the form, or reciprocity works in the form of concessions. So in terms of influence, what does that mean? Well, there's some clear messages here. One is that we should seek out no's. Right? We're often tempted to go into situations with our colleagues, with our managers, especially with people who are higher in the organization than we are, with softer asks, softer requests. Right? Don't. If you have two legitimate requests, go in with the higher request. If that's a legitimate request, go in with it, but have a backup, because you might be able to benefit from this concession-based reciprocity, right? And have some influence simply because of how you ask the question. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, please. Do we need a mic, Lena? It's for the web people.
Isn't there a point, though, where they know how you're negotiating, that you're always going in with the, here's a big ticket item that I want, and then, here's what I really want. And so you can do it a couple of times, but then if it's always the same person you're dealing with, it's that kind of negotiation piece is gone. Yeah,
and I would also say you wouldn't do it falsely, right?
Right.
So I think Bina was playing a bit of a game, and she's pretty smart to play that game. But I would say do it when you actually legitimately have two packages, and they're both reasonable, and they're both could be useful to you. Go in knowing. And then also, I would also say that every time you make a request, make sure you have a secondary package. It might be something that you hope to never table, but at least if you are in a position where you get a no, you don't have to walk away. right? So I think like this might be exactly what I want. I'm not trying to highball you, but I'm asking for what I want, but I'm also aware that I might get a no, and if I get a no, what do I do with that? Right? So it becomes an opportunity to try and figure out if there's anything that can be had within that circumstance. So I would never say that you would go in falsely, always highballing, unless it's actually a negotiation, right? Like unless you're buying a car. But in social circumstances, no, because you're right, that has relationship and reputational issues. Is that a, yeah? Any other questions? Okay. The other word, so this is about seeking out no's, the other word that I wanted to highlight for you and have you think about in terms of influence is the word thank you. Now we're listening for no's. We're kind of seeking out no's. We're kind of aware that no's are an opportunity. Thank yous are also opportunities. When you hear the word thank you, you should go, okay, that's when you've injected value into your relationship. And so what often happens when people say thank you? If somebody says thank you to you, what is often your response as Canadians, as very humble and generous Canadians? Often we say, no problem, forget about it, sure. Right? All of those responses devalue the favor. So social psychologists have looked at what happens after an exchange like that, when somebody expresses gratitude, what happens a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, based on the quality of that exchange. So if somebody says thank you, the second person says no problem, 3 weeks later, what's the value of that social exchange? Versus thank you, you're welcome, or thank you, and some other language later on. What happens in the first case is that there's a degrading of the value of the favor. And so later, if you say no problem, a week from now, the other person's actually going to think it wasn't a problem, right? That there was no real value in that exchange. Whereas if you use different language, so if you say a flat "you're welcome," that's actually much better. You're welcome. Like, I acknowledge. That's great. I'm like, this is good that we've had this exchange. You're welcome. You might even go as far as to say, I know you would do the same for me. Which is actually even a little bit savvier, right? What it creates is the opportunity for that exchange later on. So social psychologists have found that that type of language actually leads to higher levels of reciprocity or just feelings of gratitude 2 weeks later. Right? So just be careful about how about devaluing efforts that you've put in. And we've all done this to ourselves, right? As parents, we do this to ourselves all the time, where we devalue how much we've actually done. And it's not that you're trying to martyr yourself or be this, it's all been so difficult for me. It's just being honest about the effort and accepting that you've put effort into something. Pardon me. Yeah, accepting that this was a valuable exchange. Great. It's great that we were able to do this for each other. So that's another simple little tool. So this kind of takes us to a point where I'm about to start to talk about a different sort of concept. We talked a little bit about social networks, how reciprocity fits into that, some other ways of language and delivering messages that influence that change the perception of how things are exchanged or received. Any questions or thoughts about this? We have a question here, Lena. I'll leave, I will also leave a fair amount of time at the end for a little bit more of an exchange, but we'll go to Steve.
Thanks. Sorry, do you have any resources like suggested primers for like deeper dives into reciprocity?
Sure, absolutely. So I will, through Mari, I can send a list of books. The lead summary research, so the seminal researcher, the person who's kind of put a foundation behind this area and has written practitioner-oriented books that are really, really useful, is Robert Cialdini. So Cialdini. But I will share that with Mari along with a list of the books that he's written. He's extraordinary in this specific space, in the social psychology of influence. Any other? So I think it would be, I would be missing something if we talked about influence without talking about power. I'm afraid of going too far. There we go. Yeah, that's right. So I think there is when we talk about influence, we're talking today about strategies and techniques that work based on principles of human behavior across all groups, regardless of your power level, right? We're talking about lateral as well as managing up. But power is also a source of influence, and it'd be I think it'd be a bit short-sighted to ignore how power can influence people. But I also think that it's important to talk about what power actually is and how one actually acquires power. Because when I say the word power, you're probably thinking about positional power, legitimate authority, right? That somebody exists in a hierarchy in a way that is superior to my position in that hierarchy. That's often what we think about as power. It is not the only source of power. There are many sources of power. That is absolutely a very strong source of power, so I will not underrepresent that source of power. But it's important to note that if you don't have that type of power, you can acquire power in other ways. And here, power is important for a number of reasons. One is that it allows you to gain resources. It allows you to gain resources not only for yourself, but for the people that are around you, right? So you want to be able to gain resources so that you might be able to share them out, that you can have them redistributed. Power allows you some ability to have insight or express your own ideas within a room. So you want to be able to acquire some level of power, not for the Machiavellian kind of narcissistic, I want power for the sake of power reason. We're talking about useful power that helps you to influence how things happen in the room. So let's talk for a second about what power gives us, and then how you might acquire powers in ways that are outside of legitimate authority. So what power actually gives us is access to what we call a range. Oh, and my slides are so useful. I'm so sorry that you didn't get more time with this one, because I know there's so much content on it. This is what I want to get us to. What power gives us is a range of it increases our range of acceptable behaviors. The more power we have, the more we can get away with, this is something we were just talking about this morning. The more power you have, the more you can get away with, right? This is why people with high levels of legitimate authority can be complete jerks and get away with it, because they hold all the cards. But let's talk about this within the realm of normal behavior. If you have a high level of power, you can make bigger requests, make bigger asks. You can dictate how things move through a meeting, right? You can leave the room early. Like all of these, it just stretches the type of behaviors that your range, what you're able to do. If you have low levels of power and act outside of your range of acceptable behavior, you will be punished. Right? So think about that job applicant who they're straight, and I'll use law school, given that's your context, straight out of law school, starts negotiating a salary with you. Right? It's pretty easy to get to a point where that person offends. And you're like, well, that's the end of that negotiation, right? They stepped outside of the power that they hold, and they were punished for it in terms of a rescinded job offer. Right? So this is a message that I often try and share with the young people in my classrooms around understanding the limits of what you're able to ask for. Despite the fact that every young person is very special, just like every other young person, there's still a real need to understand the limits of what you can request based on your position. Right? But outside of that example, we all have limits to our behavior. And they also, when I'm talking about limits to behavior, you can also think about this in terms of gender. You can think about this in terms of having a racialized identity. It's the same thing. It's all power determining your range. So how do you acquire higher levels of power so that you can increase your range within a given context? That's the question, right? If you have legitimate authority, there you go, you've got it. But if you don't, what are other ways of expanding your range? I have a slide based on that too. It's a really good one. So how do you expand your range? There are some really good, clear, research-based tips on how to expand your range. Most of this research, so now we've moved out of social psychology, we're into the organizational behavior literature. Specifically, we're into negotiations literature to understand this little piece here. And this is actually a space where I've done a fair amount of work myself. So this is a particular interest to me. One way to increase your range, the range of possible behaviors, is to advocate for others. Advocate for others. So the way in which, again, it goes down to how you present your argument, but advocating for others changes the conversation. I'll give you an example. In my employment context, I work at a university. The only way, and like there's a natural progression to things. You move through a series of stages. There are only certain moments in your career where there's the opportunity for financial increases, right? They happen naturally, but then there's only a few times where you can negotiate them. One is when you get the job. The second is when another university tries to poach you, right? So another university comes to you, gives you an offer, and you walk into your dean's office with the offer, and you start a negotiation. I have had colleagues walk into the dean's office with the offer and say, here is the offer, I need you to beat it if I'm going to stay here. And quickly had to exit the university, right, where the dean has said, yeah, that's okay, that looks like a good offer for you. Why don't you go ahead and take that, right? Versus a colleague walking into the dean's office and saying, look, I really like the work I do here. I would like to stay here. But there's a problem. The problem is I can't ignore this offer. Here's an offer that's been put on the table. Are you able to help me, help my department, help my colleagues remain as an intact group so that I can continue my work here? That's an example of how you turn something that could be an advocating for yourself into advocating for others. Right? So now I've turned the problem on its head. I've said, this isn't my problem. Like it is my problem at the core. I'm the core of the problem. But what I'm looking for is us to solve this problem. Here's the truth of the problem. I actually would like to stay here, but it's hard to ignore this particular offer. Can you help? Right? That's changing what you're advocating for, advocating on behalf of your community, your organization, and it changes the conversation. It increases the range of behaviors. It increases what you can ask for. Right? And there are lots of other ways to advocate for others. To be in a room and to argue for policy or practices that benefit everybody, advocating for others, to make requests and figure out who are all the people that this request affects and make sure that you represent them in your arguments. All of this increases your range of possible behaviors, increases your power because you're now sharing it, sharing the motivation with the other people that you're representing in the room. Does that make sense? The next one is one that I really like that is not entirely obvious and is far more powerful than it appears to be on its face. And it's the idea of perspective taking, something that's actually really hard to do. You can increase your range of possible behaviors if you spend a little bit of time understanding the problem from the perspective of the other person, not arguing their case for them, but if you can show an understanding of their interests, you also increase the range of your range of possible behaviors. Right? So if I know you do this as lawyers, you sit down and you think about what are the arguments that the other side could bring to the table, right? Like what can I expect from them? What are the things that they'll want? What are the things they need? What do they have that gives them leverage? To the extent that you can really adopt another person's perspective, you start to talk about the problem differently. You start to be able to make offers that meet their needs and meet your needs. And if you can do that, if you can have a creative solution that meets everybody's needs, that's another source of power. I walk into the room and I'm not just arguing from my own perspective and trying to bring you over to my side. I'm trying to offer you problem-solving solutions that address what you need, but also are exactly what I want to get done, right? That's another source of power. Clear? Yeah? The other is to signal flexibility. How much do we love people that are willing to make movement? Right? Somebody walks into a room and you can demonstrate to them that you can be swayed, that you can be moved, that you hear their arguments, that you're trying to integrate their needs, wants, desires, ideas into your own requests. Signaling that flexibility, again, increases your range of possible behaviors, increases what you can ask for, how much you can ask for, when you can ask for it. The next one's very simple, gain allies, right? Like get people on side. I'm sure this is the politics of the organization, right? You're constantly doing that. Gaining people on side, getting people to support your ideas, just making friends within the organization, making sure that you're being a valuable social social person, there's a word I'm missing here, but being a valuable colleague within the organization in ways that go beyond just the work that's being done. That can also gain you a bit of range in terms of what you can ask for. And finally, displaying your expertise. This is another story. If you're really good at something, people give you a ton of credit, right? If you're just really good at your job, you're consistent, you do it well, you get a lot of leeway. It again expands your range of possible behaviors. So I went through a lot of things pretty quickly there. Any thoughts or ideas about that? I'm going to summarize what we've said here in just a second, and I'm going to then open it up broadly for questions, because I feel like I've been talking for a very long time. I'm sure there's got to be things to ask. Oh, yeah.
So I just have one question that's sort of specific to what we were just talking about. How would your advice or what we've just talked about change depending on whether you were dealing with a taker or the other person, or not personality types, the other behavior types or preferences? Would these all eventually wear somebody down regardless of whether or not they were a taker, or would you tweak depending on who you were dealing with?
See what you did there? That was you went from like the end, you tied it back to the beginning. So I don't have any research-based response to that question about how do we, the idea of power versus givers and takers, right? So I don't have a clear, I can draw from this data, which is, and if I can't do that, I always like to be clear that I'm making a guess. So I would say that there would be a difference with a taker. So the large majority of folks that you'd be dealing with would be matchers, and that's fine. Like it's fine to deal with matchers. It's actually there isn't necessarily a negative experience in dealing with matchers. So these strategies will work very well. There will be takers, and you will naturally behave differently when engaged with somebody who will not reciprocate. Right? You'll naturally start to get a bit defensive. Or a bit weary of injecting value in that direction, which I think is entirely appropriate, right? So, and often when I'm giving this talk, I talk, or when I give talks like these, I talk to organizations, like, so I've really just focused this on individuals, like, what do you do? What's your strategy? Knowing that you're all from different, or many of you from different organizations. But if I was talking to one organization, I would talk about how you would create a culture within the organization that could discourage takers and try and encourage more of the giving behaviors. So as an example, there was a study done, again, in a medical setting, where it was found that in the same hospital, on floors where there were nurses, where one nurse had the role of helping the other nurses. So one nurse was a floater, right? So one nurse is just there to support the work of the other nurses. Everybody on the floor helped out more. And people were also more willing to ask for help, which is a really lovely consequence of having a whole bunch of givers around, right? You'll get this culture of people starting to ask for help, which then continues, like it starts to perpetuate this cycle of people supporting and assisting one another. So we found those types of cultures exist a great deal more on floors with nurses. So you can create this culture in organizations using a few strategies. When I had said before that takers are not personality types necessarily, there are takers that are, there are some personality types that are tied to taking, but the takers in the way that we're labeling them, it's not a personality type. You might change depending on the context, right? And you also might change depending on your experience. You might be in an organization where you've been burned so many times that you're like, well, that's it, right? I am now a taker. So you can alter this behavior. It's not personality necessarily, unless you're a narcissist. That's different. Any other questions? I'm going to spend a second just summarizing, and then I hope we can generate a bit of a question-answer cycle here for the last 20 minutes that we have together. So here's some of the big ideas that we've talked about. If I could just, I've used a lot of language and a lot of examples, but if I could give you the big, huge ideas for this, for today's talk, it's that it's important to curate your network, right? To not allow your network to happen by happenstance. To think about where am I in my career? What do I need to achieve? How can my network help me best achieve that? So, as another example, I said I was done with examples, but I'm not. As another example, we actually know from career research that folks that are early in their career benefit from having a large number of weak ties. So this is the strength of weak ties. They have access to large volumes of resources. They have novel opportunities within their weak ties. This is where the wealth is, right? So when you're just starting and you're working your way up, it's useful to have all of these options and opportunities and resources and ideas and conversations and all of these things happening. So it's the strength of weak ties. Whereas when you're more advanced in your career, what you really benefit from are a few trusted allies, right? So you need a denser network with stronger ties, deeply connected to you. People that you trust, that you can talk to, that you can bounce ideas off of, that you can rely on, that give good advice, that give you good guidance. Right? So you want to curate your network. You want your network to be aware of what it looks like. Is it helping you? Are you central to it? Where are you in it? Is it serving you properly? Or is it a place where you need to do some work? The next big idea is be the first to give. We talked at length about reciprocity because it's one of my favorite things in the whole wide world. Be the first to give. Don't be shy about injecting a value in ways that you have a strength for. Right? Be a connector if that's what you can do well and easily. Be somebody who gives good insights. Be a good listener. Be whatever it is that adds value to your network, because the value will come back to you. Right? These are not direct one-to-one social exchanges. That's not the world we live in. Research tells us we live in a world where value comes from all kinds of places in unexpected ways. And we have to build a few things. We have to build a network that allows us to inject value into it, draw value out of it. We have to build a reputation where we are seen as somebody worth giving value to. right? And that is by our efforts on the front end. So be the first to give. Don't be reluctant to give, especially the more senior folks, right? It's easy for somebody in position of power to have a few quick ways that they give, reserving 10 minutes every couple days to do something that helps somebody else out with huge amount of reward, quick reward for you, right? Because you hold a lot of resources. You share those, you're a hero. Listen for some, so in thinking about how you make your requests, how you make your asks, how you approach people, there are certain ways you want to construct a message. We talked about some of the nuances and how you want to make sure that you are making your arguments or constructing your ideas. But we also talked about 2 magical words. We talked about the nos and the thank yous. Do not shy away from nos, right? We often walk into the room making the ask that we will know will get us a yes, but make the honest ask, make the authentic ask, and then if you have to, be prepared to pull it back, right? Because you might actually find that you end up better off than if you had made the lower ask first. Right? You might benefit from a concession-based reciprocity situation. If you have done something for somebody and they say thank you, make sure you are honest about that thank you, right? Let them know. I certainly was happy to do it. I know that you would do the same for me. I was happy to do it. You're very welcome, right? Like acknowledge what it was. There's no more no problem, unless it was no problem, right? Don't overdo it. Know how to structure your message, looking for social proofs, looking for commitment and consistency, looking for ways of making your logical arguments are always very important. So be aware of that the way you structure your argument has implications for how or whether or not you'll have influence with that argument. And then finally, this idea of expanding your range. Knowing that you walk into a room with a certain amount of power. Power is certainly based on all of the trappings that we know it's based on: legitimate authority, wealth, size, all of those things. But at the same time, power is also based on a few other intangibles that you can actually take advantage of, right? So you can expand your range by following some of the steps that we talked about earlier in terms of making sure that you're taking their perspective and some of the other items. Thanks, everyone.